Welcome to the humane and self-sustaining world of Enmo economics, an economic philosophy that incorporates the best principles of socialism and capitalism and discards the worst practices of both. It's socialism and capitalism light, capitalism with a humane heart, socialism without useless state bureaucracy. It's pure common sense, and like all beautiful things, is basically pretty simple. The recent struggle between socialism and capitalism pretty much ended with a crushing victory for capitalism. Capitalism as we know it is very different from the ideas of Adam Smith, whose name has long been linked to the creation of capitalism. The economic model we have to endure, and which is called capitalism, is in fact just a euphemism for a very ancient practice, exploitation of the poor and the weak by the rich and the powerful. It's utterly ruthless and intrinsically self-destructive. But its promise of huge profits for the few make it permanently alluring, and its utter ruthlessness makes it very easy to replicate somewhere else, no matter the thousands of years of history that prove its inherent evil and self-destructive nature. That's why every empire that's ever existed hasn't lasted more than a few centuries before some new empire has come along to fill the power vacuums that are inevitably created when old empires eventually collapse under the weight of their own debauched excesses and corruption. Although the venue of global empire frequently changes, its economic model is basically the same today as it was thousands of years ago. The constant change of venue is because it's never been the intention of emperors to build stable, long-lasting economic systems committed to the economic welfare and security of all citizens and the long-term conservation of natural resources and our planet's fragile environment. Emperors and their lackeys have only ever wanted more and more personal wealth and power for themselves as quickly as possible. Fill your pockets today and let tomorrow take care of itself has always been the underlying economic principle of these parasites, and it still is. Shoot the wounded is how Andy Grove, chairman of Intel, accurately describes today's global economic model. Socialism is often seen as the opposite of capitalism. When it emerged as a serious force in the 19th century, it sent shivers down the spines of the ruling classes, who resolved never to rest until it had been eradicated. Power and wealth is a lethal combination when it's contained in the hands of just a few individuals. And although it's taken power and wealth almost 200 years to do it, socialism is effectively no more. Socialism did not disappear because the philosophy of socialism is seriously weak or flawed. Had it been left alone and unmolested since its formal birth just after the Russian Revolution, it's quite likely that it would have been capitalism that ceased to exist some decades ago. But it's not the nature of power and wealth to allow any challenges to their supremacy. As far as new economic ideas are concerned, competition is never welcome. Although socialism is a perfectly reasonable economic system and infinitely more humane than the gangsterism we currently endure, it had its faults. Possibly the most serious of these was the creation of the superstate, a monstrous bureaucracy of pointless clerical jobs that served little practical purpose other than continual enlargement of the state. And as it grew, it became more and more intrusive on people's lives by creating more pointless rules and regulations whose only real use was in creating employment for more unnecessary bureaucrats. Another failing of socialism, especially in its more extreme version, communism, was the considerable disincentive for people to exert themselves. People were conditioned to worship conformity, despise difference, and to treat with contempt, fear, and distrust those who wanted to be different or to have more for themselves and their families. Socialism did provide for those who wanted more by permitting them to have it if they worked more, a perfectly reasonable principle. But for many, the penalty in terms of extra tax deducted from their pay made it pointless to do so. Taxes that would only be wasted paying for more pointless bureaucrats performing more pointless tasks. Offsetting these weaknesses of socialism are its fine and valuable ideals, such as ensuring that no one goes hungry or thirsty, that no one is homeless or unable to receive a good education or medical treatment. These are great ideals. And although socialism was defeated by its ruthless enemy, known as capitalism, history will know that it was a defeat to a pitiless monster, not a philosophical failure. And the great ideals of socialism will always inspire the hearts of good people until they become a reality. I should repeat my point that although the economic system that rules us is called capitalism, it isn't the capitalism that Adam Smith is credited with creating. What we have is gangsterism, the exact same economic model that gangsters use, only it's on a much, much bigger scale. Capitalism such as Adam Smith might have had in mind is not unreasonable. Smith, deeply rooted in moral philosophy, would never have accepted the legalized villainy that we have to endure and which calls itself capitalism. There's very little wrong with the theories of Adam Smith, except for one very significant defect. Smith's theories assumed good and responsible government, which is something that didn't exist in his day, as he himself acknowledged, and it most certainly does not exist today. Real capitalism, the sort Smith might have had in mind, has only one virtue, but it's a very important virtue. Real capitalism allows people to own property, and being able to own property will always be important to people. Even in the most minimalist, so-called primitive communal subsistence economies, people like to own some things, such as their own tools, clothing, and housing. The version of capitalism being practiced today is a bastardized, obscene economic model which, if he knew would have his name associated with it, would have Adam Smith spinning in his grave. It's a model where the poor's right to own enough property to enjoy comfortable lives is sacrificed to the superior right of the never-satisfied super-rich to own as much property as they can get their grasping hands on. However, the fact that capitalism encourages the principle of property ownership is strongly appealing to most people, because most people like to own their own things. And they often like to own different things to others. If this was not the case, if gangster capitalists who rule the world were not able to exploit a natural human desire for material wealth, they would have ceased to exist thousands of years ago when they were merely boy emperors. The huge success of gangster capitalism in its motherland, the United States, is largely due to the ability of the super-rich to exploit the fabricated fears of the poor that a socialist model would prevent them from owning property. Therefore, any economic model that aspires to long-term success cannot afford to overlook the very human desire to own things. Although Enmo economics is a model of my creation, much of its underlying philosophy is far from original. The expression bread and roses is an old one, familiar to anyone who has studied the history of working people. It refers to the very simple and reasonable expectation of people to have enough to live on together with enough time and leisure to enjoy some simple pleasures too. Enmo is a variation of this principle and tries to make a fairly clear differentiation between the economic roles of the state and the private sector, recognizing that both are essential to a healthy economy. It proposes that supplying enough in the way of essential products and services is the duty of the state, whilst provision of more, i.e. non-essential products and services, may be left largely to the private sector, properly regulated. Think of a standard water tap, for example, and bottles of water. The state would be responsible for what comes out of the tap, ensuring that it's of good quality and that people have enough of it for their needs. But the private sector, properly regulated, could sell as many bottles of water as it likes for whatever profit it could make. Or imagine a nut cutlet and a piece of steak. The state would ensure that nutritious vegan food is plentiful and easily available, but steaks would only be obtainable from the private sector, properly regulated. Enmo is short for enough and more. It's an economic philosophy that says that the duty of the state is to ensure that people have enough to enjoy secure, comfortable, leisurely lives. The private sector may be free to provide more for those who choose to spend their time accumulating material wealth and possessions. The basic definitions of these terms will usually be obvious. It's obvious that the state must ensure no one need go hungry or without reliable public transport, say. But the state is not responsible for ensuring that everyone has gourmet meals or a Lamborghini sports car. Although there will always be a grey area between the two roles, which must inevitably cause a little tension, the vitally important principle of economic justice would be infinitely better served by this model than what we are currently forced to endure. In the next section of this talk, I'll look at the vitally important topic of money.